Welcome to NCSA 2020 Virtual.
Hi, everyone. So the title of this paper is What Makes a Citizen? Symbolic Boundaries of Legal and Cultural Membership in the United States. I'm Adem, and this paper is co-authored with Denise Ambriz. So the motivation for this project, we know that immigration continues to be one of the most challenging social and political issues facing both the United States and Europe and worldwide. In the United States in particularly though, long-standing debates over who should be included in the polity have recently erupted in continuous battle over attempts to add citizenship question to the US Census, the future of individual with undocumented status, and even proposal to drop birthright citizenship from the US Constitution. At the heart of this discussion is really the question, what makes a citizen? We know from previous work that citizenship is really a central axis of stratification, not only reflecting the inclusive nature of its members, but also exclusionary attitudes toward outgroups. Past research really have theorized citizenship as a macro level phenomena and focus on the state as a sole author for reproducing the boundaries between citizens and non-citizens. As we will argue in this paper though, a state-centered approach really limits our theoretical understanding of how actors beyond political elites evaluate citizenship claims. In this study, we really define citizenship, although there's multiple meanings, but we define it as a process of making membership claims on politicized people and institutions that must be recognized within particular normative understanding of citizenship. Something to highlight with this particular claims definition is the importance of recognition, where in-group members draw on normative assumption and cultural practices regarding group membership and boundaries to categorize some claims as worth of recognition and others as illegitimate. We examined views toward claims for legal membership, being considered a citizen of the state or formal inclusion to the state, and claims for cultural membership, being accepted as a fellow American. These two dimensions, we argue, are often used interchangeably, where questions regarding what makes a citizen are conflated with question about who is an American. Yet qualitative studies we know have shown that ethnic and racial minorities experience, both in the US and Europe, demonstrate that having access to legal or formal membership is often a necessary but insufficient condition to fully enjoy the substantive or symbolic belonging in the polity. These studies then exemplify the necessity to distinguish questions related to citizenship as legal status on the one hand, and citizenship as cultural membership on the other, both theoretically and empirically. So what have previous work done or shown when it comes to citizenship literature? By far, one of the most important distinction and debate is the ethnic-civic distinction, both for understanding patterns within a country and cross-nationally. We know, for example, that an ethnic representation of citizenship, which is often exemplified by countries such as Germany, especially pre-2000, birthplace and ancestry really influence who can become a citizen, at least at the institutional level. A civic understanding, on the other hand, is perceived as more inclusive for immigrants, as it allows greater access to legal membership by showing more adherence to norms, for example, speaking the national language, and rules considered pertinent to the national community. Civic nationalism is often characterized by countries such as US and France. In one of the largest study on American nationalism, for example, Schildkraft finds that about 10% of native-born Americans say being white is important in making someone a true American, and 35% saying being Christian is important. This is in stark contrast to finding related to civic boundaries, where over 95% of respondents reported that respecting political institutions and laws matter far more than ethnocultural boundaries for defining Americanism. In recent time, though, a lot of people have challenged these results, especially arguing that ethnocultural boundaries such as religion or being Muslim has been far more influential, in particular after 9/11, for views regarding national identities in the US. It might be the case that individuals hold an ethnocentric view of an American identity, but are less likely to express these opinions due to social desirability bias. So the current study is trying to take the institutional understanding of the civic and ethnic and cultural policies regarding citizenship and examine public opinions, but also kind of expanding previous work to understand how boundaries related to contemporary immigration influence our understanding of nationhood today. This is in particular when we think about legal status and when we think about age of arrival. One of the ways that we overcome the social desirability bias, as I will discuss briefly or soon, is using an experimental design. This will allow us to more clearly disentangle views related to civic boundaries and views related to ethnocultural or racial boundaries. One of the common trend in the perception of immigration literature, this is especially since 2016, is limiting analysis to white respondents. However, as argued by more recent studies, this approach severely limits one's capacity to make convincing explanatory claims, especially when we only look at one subgroups. We also know that although all native-born Americans are considered citizens, ethnic and racial minorities tend to have a far more complex and conditional perception of their American in-group identity. Thus, we expect to see a group-level variation for the evaluation of both legal and cultural membership among Black, Latino respondents and whites. So the research question here are two very straightforward ones. How do US-born Americans draw symbolic boundaries when evaluating legal and cultural membership claims? And do white US-born Americans evaluate membership claims differently than non-white US-born Americans? So we use the COINJO survey design. This will allow us not only to include far more characteristic that is related to current immigration debates, but it also limits the influence of social desirability bias. I will go into design in the next slide or so. As argued by other scholars, COINJO's survey design also capture better decision-making processes by including more information needed to evaluate claims such as citizenship. For this design, participants were presented with a total of 10 profiles of hypothetical non-citizens, 5 comparisons, and profile varied along different dimensions. So at the beginning, each respondent read this introductory text. Many non-citizens live in the United States. People have different opinions regarding which of them deserve to become citizens. In the survey, you were presented with profiles describing the characteristic of non-citizens living in the US. For each pair of profiles, please look at the information carefully and then indicate who you believe deserves a pathway to citizenship. You may feel like you don't have enough information about each person, and that is okay. There are no right and wrong answers. So these are the dimension all the respondents were exposed to with different levels. So for nationality, we had 7 different groups, including Iraq, Mexico, Nigerian, German, and Canadians. Legal status, we have 2. Either you are documented or undocumented immigrants, and then English proficiency, there's 3 level, and age of arrival, you weren't born in the country, but you came here as a child, or that you came here at the age of 18. Just to give you a brief overview of how the design worked. So all the respondents read, for example, 2 profiles, like these examples here, and then they had to indicate which of these 2 people they personally believe is more deserving of citizenship. to understand how we mitigated the social desirability bias. So for example, for immigrant 1 and immigrant 2, they see almost identical information. So even if they thought we were perhaps trying to get at racial attitudes, they wouldn't be able to quickly identify that because you do have two similar profiles of Mexicans, for example. The things that do vary is, in this example, is age, self-identification, religions, and reason for migrating. Again, all of the variation is completely random, but what happens is that it makes it it gives the respondent a lot more information, but also minimizing the respondent's ability to detect what we're trying to get at with this design. So we have two outcomes. For the first, we have legal membership. We asked respondent, if you had to choose between them, which person do you think is more deserving of citizenship, person 1 and person 2? And we also included a scale just to make sure that our outcome really didn't influence our main results. And the scale asked, now on a scale from 1 to 7, where 1 indicates definitely not deserving of citizenship and 7 indicating definitely deserving of citizenship, how would you rate the person or the immigrant profile? And we do find substantially the results are pretty similar. And then for cultural membership, we have two questions on a scale from 1 to 7, where 1 indicates not at all American and 7 indicates definitely American. How do you think most Americans would perceive person 1 or person 2? They only get to evaluate one profile at a time. And then we also ask on a scale from 1 to 7, when 1 indicates not at all American and 7 indicates definitely American, how do you perceive this particular profile? And we do want to distinguish between most American and you, and precisely because it might be the case that if people understand it from a society perspective, they might have a different point of view than compared to their own perspective, which actually we find it to be, again, very similar results, which was quite surprising. For the data collection, we use Qualtrics, and we try to get a national representative sample. We had about 800 respondents. Since each respondent evaluated 10 profiles, we have about 8,000 observations. Since in a conjoint design, the unit of analysis is the characteristics, so the elements that we are the profiles that we are including. So in this case, it's 10 profiles times 8,000. So we did also oversample Black and Latino respondent, and we restricted the sample to those born in the US, again, to have a better understanding of the non-citizen and citizen boundary. This is the respondent characteristic for descriptive statistic. In general, it all looked fairly similar to the national representative samples, with the exception of the race and ethnic makeup of our sample, which is have a higher proportion of Black and Hispanic respondents. So I will go over the first results, which is pertaining to legal membership. So overall, we didn't find that nationality really mattered as much for deservingness of citizenship once we control for other factors such as legal status and age of arrival. The only significant comparison results are that Mexican immigrants are around 6% more likely to be granted immigrants or being perceived as deserving of formal inclusion compared to Iraqi immigrants. On the surface, these results might seem counterintuitive given recent work on racial resentment and Latino aversion. But later analysis would demonstrate that in order to understand these patterns, we really need to use an in-group preference model. Now, compared to nationality, we do find, and perhaps not surprisingly, that legal status have a substantial effect on legal membership or views regarding deservingness of formal inclusion. Compared to profiles of documented immigrants, for example, profiles depicting undocumented immigrants are about 23 percentage points less likely to be viewed as deserving of citizenship. And this is net of factors. We also see that another strong predictor of legal membership is age of arrival. Compared to immigrants who have spent their childhood in the US, those who arrived at the age of 18 are around 16 percentage points less likely to be granted citizenship. Arguably, it could be the case that because they did actually grow up here, immigrants who arrived as children are perceived as have a stronger claim to legal membership and considered more culturally similar to US citizen. And this kind of reflect recent public opinion that have collected by other data in terms of more inclusive towards children who have been here since, undocumented immigrants who have been here since childhood. Other effect that we find is that reasons for migrating is also important. Here we see, for example, that for economic reason, we do find that people who say that they're escaping violence in the home country really have a higher probability to be granted citizenship compared to those who say they're coming here for economic reason. And this is also the case with escaping religious persecution in the home country compared to economic reason. We also again see that English and religion matters, but to a lesser extent compared to legal status. And now when we go to cultural membership, we do find that compared to legal membership, we do find that cultural membership, that nationality really do matter for this type of group membership inclusion. Here we see that on average profile depicting non-white immigrants, Chinese, Iraqi, Mexican, Nigerian, and Haitian profiles are significantly less likely to be perceived by larger society compared to the reference category, in this case, which is German and immigrants. And this is important to note that this result holds once we control for legal status. To give a better understanding of how the patterns occur for cultural membership, this is showing just the raw predicted probabilities once we control for other factors, that Canadian are the ones that are far more likely to be perceived as American, and then Germans, Chinese, Haitian, Nigerians, and Mexican, and lastly, Iraqi. We also find that legal status and arrival to the US matters for cultural membership, but to a lesser extent compared to membership. And also English proficiency and religion matter across these outcomes. Lastly, I'm just going to briefly go over how these membership evaluation vary by racial groups. So here, model 1, we show that for nationality, white respondent, nationality really didn't have a strong effect for white respondent. This is in stark contrast when we look at how the patterns occurred for Black and Hispanic respondent. For example, as indicated by Model 1B, Black respondents are significantly more likely to grant citizenship to Nigerian profiles compared to German profiles. And again, this is net of other factors. We see similar pattern for Latino respondents who are more likely to grant Mexican profile citizenship compared to German profiles. We also find that legal status and arrival to the US matters for all respondents, for white, Black, and Hispanics, but to a far lesser extent compared to Black respondent and Hispanic when we compare it to white respondents. When we just look at the American identity now, the last membership evaluation by racial groups, here in contrast to legal membership, we do find that nationality matters now for white respondents, but not for ethnic minorities. Here we see that white respondents are far more likely to think non-white groups are less American compared to German, and the only significant result of nationality for Black and Hispanic respondents is the Iraqi effect, which is consistent across all models. And again, for American identity, we do find that undocumented and age of arrival matters in a similar way across models here, but to a lesser extent compared to Black and Hispanic respondents. So the conclusions. One of the main arguments that we make is that the civic and ethnic debate, whether civic boundaries or ethnic boundaries matter, really have to be first looked at from a public opinion perspective, but more importantly, that the question whether, it's not whether civic and ethnic matters, but how they matter across outcomes. Here, for example, we do find that legal status matter on how UN Americans view legal membership or formal inclusion, but when we think about cultural membership, we find that actually nationality or ethnicity matters far more than legal status. And lastly, we argue that models for theoretical models understanding immigration attitudes really need to go beyond just looking at white respondents, in particular since we have a more diverse makeup right now, and immigration have really changed who is considered an in-group or out-group, which then pushes us to think more critically how, for example, Latino respondents would view other Latino immigrants or other, I'm sorry, can I redo that?
Yeah, go ahead.
I got completely thrown off now. Okay, I'm just gonna make it simple. Gosh, I'm sorry. Okay, and lastly, we argue that our resolve pushes us to think beyond the Black-white divide or using white respondents to understand attitudes toward immigrants, especially when we think about who is considered an in-group and out-group in a more diverse society. We really want to thank Patricia McManus, Brian Powell, and everyone else who has helped us to move this project forward, and all the support and funding that we have received from Indiana University and the Department of Sociology. Thank you very much.